So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mayra Lara, and I work for the Family Focus Resource Center, which is a nonprofit sponsored program of Cal State University Northridge, which is CSUN. We are a parent center that helps you understand and navigate early intervention, special education, and regional center and related services. And today we have Sofia Cervantes from the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, who will be presenting on IPP Strategies Part 2. So with that being said, welcome, Sofia, and it's all yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Mayra, and thank you to the organization for the invitation. And it's good to be here, whether you are here currently on Zoom or watching this later. Hello. So we will get started. Today we are doing a part 2 of IPP strategies. So how to get what you need from Regional Center. Okay, so again, my name is Sofia Cervantes. I'm with the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. We are a state advocacy agency. And so our agency is in federal law, and it gives us the role of advocating for systemic change for our communities. So meaning changing policies, practices, laws that impact not just the access for services for people with intellectual and developmental disability, but also the quality, the accessibility, etc. And then we also provide technical assistance and capacity building, so training. So we do a range of topics, and sometimes we develop these topics based on the number of technical assistant calls that we get. And so also technical assistance, meaning answering people's questions, right? The state has that term, technical assistance, and that's just long for answering your question. So please feel free to keep us as a resource beyond this training, and know that we can support you and or give you information and or direct you to somewhere else. Okay. All right. So for today's training, please feel free to interact on the chat. If there's a question that you'd like to pose, please feel free to put it on the chat, and I'll try to weave it in to our conversation. And or if you're comfortable, feel free to, raise your hand or ask your question. All right. So first, I'd like to let you know we did put several links on the chat. And if you press that first link, I just want to let you know, I'm going to share screen. You will see a screen pop up that looks something like this. And you guys are looking at my Google Drive, is that right? Okay, perfect. So this link actually has remained the same from part 1, part 2, and in October when we do part 3, you'll be able to use the same link. If you want materials for part 1 that we discussed, you'll be able to click here and you'll see an English and Spanish folder come up. And then for today, 9/26, boy, we're almost done with September. Incredible, huh? So you can press this second folder and press English, and you will see the materials that we'll be discussing today. And the document with a little star here is our PowerPoint. And so you'll be able to click on that and have access to all this information forever, I would say. So this link remains active and you can access it whenever. And if we add materials to this after the training, you'll be able to have the most updated version of whatever is posted on this Google Drive. Okay, so know that you have access to that. And can you all see my presentation now on the screen? Yes, perfect. Okay, sounds good. So again, today is part 2 of IPP strategies. I'm trying to recall, I did your part 1, so I'm trying to recall if the majority were here. But so I'll do a very, very brief review on part 1, and then we'll continue with part 2. So we're talking again about IPP strategies, how to get services, avoid difficulties, and obtain the results that you need. And so one thing that we hope from this training is that after going through this training, that you would feel more confident more prepared going into your IPP meetings, right? Sometimes when we answer parents' questions, they tell us, oh, I feel a little nervous about it. I don't really know what to say or how to participate, and et cetera. And so we understand those feelings, and we hope that with this information, you would feel more comfortable and more aware of your role, more prepared for these meetings. If you were here last time, we started with a brief, true and false activity. And so in your presentation, you can go through these if you'd like. And then at the end of the presentation, you'll be seeing the answers to each of these. Okay, so we did this last time. Feel free, if you missed this last time, feel free to go back to the presentation and sort of answer these for yourselves, and then check your answers with the end of the presentation. You'll find the answers. So, okay, and pretty much we are answering these true false questions as we go through the presentation. Okay, so first thing we talked about last month was the eligibility criteria for regional center services, and the law that governs regional centers is called the Lanterman Act, and it's part of the Welfare and Institutions Code, also known as WIC. The WIC code is Welfare and Institutions Code. And so based on the law, the eligibility criteria is the following, right? And again, we reviewed this last month. And so in order to be eligible for regional center, 4 things must be true, right? And so here we clarified that it's not, quote unquote, enough, right, for a person to have a diagnosis, for example, a diagnosis of autism, but rather they should have one of the identified diagnoses and also meet the criteria, which are the other 3 things. So the things that must be true in order for someone to be eligible for regional center is 1, the condition had to have began before the age of 18. Right? So the condition must have begun before the age of 18. Now, we clarified that if a person today is 30 years old and they had never heard about regional center and they are now 30, they can go to regional center and ask to be evaluated for eligibility for regional center. What they will have to prove, though, is that their condition began before the age of 18. It doesn't mean that only people under 18 can approach the regional center. Older individuals can approach the regional center, but in order to be eligible, they will have to demonstrate that the condition was present before the age of 18. This sometimes becomes a bit difficult, maybe for people that were not born in this country or did not grow up in this country, being that sometimes that means they may not have the documentation to demonstrate that they had the condition before the age of 18. So keep that in mind. But so 1, to be eligible for regional center, the condition had to have begun before the age of 18. 2, they must demonstrate they must have one of these diagnoses, which is intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, autism, epilepsy, or something that looks like intellectual disability. Okay, and so they call that the 5th category. So if, let's say there's someone who has a brain injury, and so their diagnosis isn't intellectual disability or autism or cerebral palsy or epilepsy, but their needs look like the needs of someone with intellectual disability, right? Then there's a whole, someone with Down syndrome, right? It may look like intellectual disability. And so individuals may qualify under what Regional Center calls the 5th category. Okay, so that's number 2. So the person must demonstrate the condition began before the age of 18. 2, they must have one of the identified diagnoses. 3, they must demonstrate substantial disability in at least 3 of the following 7 life areas, right? And so here we see having a autism diagnosis is not quote unquote enough, right? Because there could be someone with autism who does not demonstrate substantial disability in at least 3 of these areas, right? They may not have that substantial disability, even though they have the diagnosis of autism. And so, third thing that must be found is that the person has substantial disability in at least 3 of these areas, which is self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, self-direction. And then when evaluating adults, we're looking also at capacity for independent living and economic self-sufficiency. Okay, and so again, the person would have to demonstrate they have substantial disability in at least 3 of these 7 areas. Okay, now, although here we're talking about eligibility, what I want to point out is once you're eligible and you have your meeting every year, it's a good idea to keep these categories in mind, because technically what we're doing every IPP meeting is demonstrating how they still have substantial disability under each or some of these 7 areas, right? So really, how can we prepare for an IPP meeting? Every year, pull out this list, right? And you can do what's called a parent report. Okay, so you can, or a self-report if you're a self-advocate, right? So putting parent report and then first heading self-care, and then just bullet points demonstrating the needs under self-care, right? So the person is 10 years old and you still have to help them shower, brush their teeth, get dressed. Typically, a 10-year-old is able to do those self-care activities. But if your son or daughter, because of their disability, does not have those skills yet, then those are needs that we can advocate for during the IPP meeting, right? And so we would be looking at these 7 areas and saying, okay, self-care, what are all the needs under self-care? Next heading in your report, receptive and expressive language. What are all the needs that we have under this? Learning, again, what are all the needs under learning? All the needs under mobility, all the needs under self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency, right? And so keep in mind that when we talk about needs, what that means is we're looking for the gaps between the skill that a person, your son's or daughter's age, without a disability, what skill do they demonstrate, and where does your son or daughter fall in that spectrum of ability, right? So needs are those things that your son or daughter does not quite reflect the ability of someone their same age without a disability. So when we talk about needs, we're looking at those gaps, right? And why do we talk about needs? Because that's what we hope to get services for, right? There's this gap. They need to develop more skill in order to meet this level of ability. So we're going to need a service to help them reach that goal. Okay, or reach that level. And so again, we're talking about eligibility right now, but I just want to make a early parentheses here saying these areas are ones that we should really have in our mind, because at the end of the day, this is what had them become eligible, right? This is why they became eligible for services, because they demonstrated need in these areas. So what do we do every year? Demonstrate how that's still true. Okay. And then lastly, in talking about the 4 things that must be true to be eligible for regional center services, is the condition is expected to last indefinitely, right? So when regional center is doing their evaluation, they are looking to answer these 4 questions, right? Did the condition begin before the age of 18? Do they have one of the identified diagnoses? Do they demonstrate substantial disability in at least 3 of the 7 areas? And is this condition expected to last indefinitely? Okay. And so here we see that with our example earlier, where we said, maybe a child had a brain injury. So if this brain injury is expected for the difficulties due to the brain injury to last indefinitely, so throughout their whole lives, then they're meeting eligibility criteria. However, let's say that a child had a brain injury, had a car accident, some sort of accident, and they have a brain injury, but the doctor has said, with therapy, in about 2 or 3 years, they're going to be back to, their baseline as if nothing ever happened. If that were true, then they would not be eligible for regional center, because one of the criteria is the condition has to be expected to last forever, right? And so keeping that in mind, right? So if the condition has an end point, then that criteria would not be met for regional center, okay? And here quickly, I want to make review another point that I believe we talked about last time, because when someone is evaluated as they're looking if they're eligible for regional center, because regional center had to have answered, yes, this condition is going to last indefinitely. Years later, if they want to say, regional center being if they want to say, I don't think that your son or daughter qualifies or can continue receiving regional center services because they've made so much progress. They don't have the condition anymore. They're not disabled anymore. They don't qualify for services anymore. If that were to happen, what regional center would have to do at that point is prove that their initial assessment was erroneous, was a mistake, that they made a mistake at the beginning when they themselves determined, yes, this condition is going to last indefinitely, right? So if we get a few calls from parents saying, hey, my son has made progress, I think he still needs a lot of help, but regional center is actually telling me he doesn't qualify anymore. He doesn't have a disability anymore, is what they're saying. So the information we provide is saying, if that is true, it's not enough per se for regional center to say, oh, they've graduated, they've made so much progress, they're done. They actually would have to go back and say, we made a mistake at the very beginning. Because again, at the very beginning, what they said is this condition is going to last indefinitely. So then when years pass, regional center can't just say, oh, never mind, they're cured or their condition is gone, because at the beginning they said it would be there forever. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. What's important about this too, or what this should lead us to think about, is sometimes what we see is when a person is at a certain developmental stage, they may have made so much progress, and that's what we hope for, right? And they may have made so much progress that during that time period, they appear to not have any needs and not have a disability. However, what we sometimes see is when they reach the next developmental stage, we again see a gap. And so again, the person might need services to help them navigate and sort of catch up to that next developmental phase. So for example, a teenager, right? Maybe they've received early start services, early intervention. They've done so well. So when they're teenagers, you're kind of like, they're doing so well. They look like their peers. Their skills are to par with their peers. Excuse me. However, then they enter college. And now college and the adult developmental stage requires different skills. And when they face this next level, we might then find, okay, we see the needs again. There's a gap again. Okay. And so we want to be mindful that whenever we see our children making progress, that's awesome. And we remain optimistic and great about that. Also keeping in mind that typically with developmental disabilities, we will see them hit some roadblocks at every stage in their development, typically, right? And so we may want to be mindful of that as we maybe think, oh, could they graduate regional center? Maybe they don't need anything anymore. They're doing so well. We may want to consider, let me wait till that next developmental stage and see if at that point they need some support. So keep in mind, last month we reviewed, the Land Treatment Act says there's no minimum or maximum amount of services that a person can have under regional center. So meaning a person can have 0 services and be a regional center client, and another person can have 10 services based on their need and be a regional center client. The law says there's no minimum and no maximum. So what that means is there might be a phase in their life where your child has 0 services because they don't have a lot of needs, right? Or they have no needs, or the needs are being met by other places like the school district, your insurance, etc., right? But you may still remain a regional center client with 0 services. And perhaps for some of you, you may consider that might be a good way to go to, again, see them cross that next developmental phase and see if at that point they don't have any needs. Right. And so keeping in mind at every developmental stage, they may need some support. OK, so we began last month's presentation with this, reviewing this eligibility criteria, talking about how we could go to these 7 areas to prepare for, meetings with the regional center every year or as needed. Okay, so this is the eligibility criteria. 1, condition had to have began before the age of 18. 2, they must demonstrate or they must have a diagnosis of one of the identified, including a 5th category if needed. 3, they must demonstrate substantial disability in at least 3 of these 7 areas. And then 4, the condition has to be expected to last indefinitely. Okay, so if those things are true, then you become eligible for regional center. And thus you now have an IPP meeting. Okay, a little point here to make: if you are found not eligible, do know that you always have the right to appeal that denial of eligibility. And in fact, in your Google Drive, I have put a packet there for appealing eligibility denial. Okay, and also know that in October, part 3 of our presentation, we're going to focus just on that. How do we appeal denials of eligibility, denials of services, etc. Okay, so for that, you would go to what's called a fair hearing. And again, don't miss part 3. If you're interested in that, we will cover that in more detail. Okay, so if at this point in the process you are found not eligible, you can appeal. If you are found eligible, then we move on, right? You have an IPP now, you are given a service coordinator, and at least every year you meet and talk about the needs, okay? So how to be ready for these meetings, how to prepare for these meetings. It's important to not simply ask for services, but to use what we call the formula, okay? And the reason we say this is sometimes, parents will call us and they'll say, I called, I asked for the service and they said no, right? I went to my meeting, they asked for it and they said no. And so what we're looking at here is it's important for us to use the formula. And the formula is, let's follow this pyramid, okay, that we see here on your screen. So it's important to first identify, demonstrate the need that your son or daughter has, because services are based on individual needs. So if we ask for a service without first establishing the need, it's very likely that the regional center will say no, maybe, right? Because we maybe have not demonstrated the need. Okay, so one, our biggest contribution to the IPP meetings really are to demonstrate the need. And this is why we mentioned writing a parent report. How can you identify your son's or daughter's needs? Do a parent report, right? Where you identify the needs under each area, and that can sort of be your guide during the meeting. This is what they need under this category of life or area. This is what they need. So going down that list. Now, after discussing the needs, what's the next step that would be the most effective to then asking for a service is writing a goal area based on the needs that the person has. So we identify needs. As a team, you develop goals that are written into the IPP. Right? And again, very important, they get documented into the IPP. And then, now with that foundation, then we ask for services to address the goals that we want them to meet. If we were denied one of those services, the conversation might lend itself for you asking, well, I don't understand, right? We identified a goal, but you're denying a service for him to meet that goal. How is it then that they're supposed to achieve that goal area if you're denying a service? Help me understand, right? So the process becomes a little bit more linear and a little bit harder to argue against the provision of a service, right? Because in the IPP now, you have needs, you have goals, and then you have your request for services. And so it only makes sense for the regional center to give you that service that will meet that goal area, that will get rid of the need. So as you participate in your IPP meetings, it's so important to remember this, right? Do not simply ask for a service. And I would add here, ask for that service within an IPP meeting, within an actual meeting, because what you want to do is be able to use this formula. Sometimes we, get calls from parents and they say, I asked for this service and they still haven't told me if they're going to give it to me or not. And I ask, how did you ask for the service? Well, I called her, right? I called her, and hear me out. Not that I'm saying don't call them, don't do it. I'm just saying within the IPP meeting, that's the opportunity you have to build this case, right? Need, goal, service. If we just do it as a brief phone call, one, keep in mind, there's nothing in writing that says you even spoke, that says what you spoke about. And in this system, actually in several systems, if it's not in writing, what's the end of that phrase? It didn't happen, right? So if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So I'm not saying don't call, but I am saying asking for a service really deserves an IPP meeting so that you can discuss as a team what will be appropriate for that person, right? And so keep in mind, right, this is part of the things that we reviewed last week. Keep in mind that you can ask for a meeting. Typically it happens once a year, but you can ask for a meeting as needed. How do we do it? In writing. And they have 30 days to provide that meeting, to hold that meeting with you. Okay. And this is again why we say doing it in writing is the way to go, because that way you can demonstrate the clock, right? You can demonstrate how many days passed and they haven't held the meeting. If you just do it over the phone or you don't have proof in writing, then we really don't know when the 30-day clock started, right? So then it's a little bit more difficult to advocate and to demonstrate, hey, they're actually breaking the law by not following these timelines. You won't have much to show for, right? So this is what's important. So keep in mind, you can ask for an IPP meeting as needed. We're not saying, ask for one every week, every month, but as needed, right? If the person's needs changed, it is highly appropriate to ask for a meeting where you will, as a team, talk about the needs, develop appropriate goals, and then request services. Right? So the IPP meeting, it's designed for this kind of conversation. And again, we can see a phone call may not give enough, room for this type of dialogue. Also, keep in mind that you can record your IPP meeting. Okay. And so that can be very useful. One, in having record of what the conversation was like. Two, it can help you remember details that sometimes in the moment when we're in that meeting, we could forget. So when you request for an IPP meeting, keep in mind that you can say, I'm requesting an IPP meeting, make sure the date is there. And then this is already my notice that I will be recording this meeting. You have the right to record as long as you give them at least 24-hour notice. And so if you do it firsthand when you request an IPP meeting, then perfect. You don't have to worry about notifying them again that you're going to record, because you already did notify them and let them know that you were going to record. Okay, so then we see this, right? Right? The importance of the IPP meeting. Again, last month, last month we discussed, based on the Lanterman Act, there is no minimum and no maximum amount of services under regional center. Okay. And so what that means, again, is there could be a person who's a regional center client, right? And they may be receiving 0 services. Okay. All while there's another person, regional center client, who has several services. So what's the difference here? It is based on the need. Okay. Now, that is why the law also says services are individualized. Okay, they're individualized. Things are according to each individual need. The law does not specify an amount of service that a person can't exceed. The law also does not establish a budget amount, right? That is not in the law. So what is in the law? Services, budgets are based on need. Someone has a little bit of need, they're probably going to have a little bit of services and a little bit budget, right? A lower budget. And if someone has lots of needs, they're probably going to have lots of services, therefore a higher budget, right? Everything is based on the need, which again, I make the point, that's why in the IPP meetings, it's so important to identify the need. That could include if your son or daughter, sometimes incidents occur, and those can be very difficult. And those can also be useful in demonstrating the need, right? So prior to being with the state council and advocate, I was a service provider. And so I provided direct services, and there were incidents that happened sometimes. They ran off in the mall, and we had to call security. The neighbors called the cops because they were having a difficult time. They were dysregulated in the home, right? They heard things shatter, they heard yelling and crying. So the cops came. All that documentation can be important and maybe a bit of a blessing in disguise to prove your need. Okay, if there are notes from a therapist, a psychologist, psychiatrist, anything that demonstrates the level of need that your son or daughter has could be a very important thing, because again, Services are based on individual needs, okay? And so our biggest job is to demonstrate the need, okay? And then we talked a little bit about regional center purchase of service policies and how these exist, and it's helpful for us to know about them. However, keeping in mind that each regional center policy has exceptions, right? And the reason why that is because the policies cannot be more restrictive than the law. So if the law says there's no minimum or maximum, and the policy wants to put a maximum, that's fine. But if a person says, I need more than that maximum that you identified should be the maximum, I need more because of this, this, and this, you have the right to do that, right? So policies are there are guides, and at the same time, you have the right to appeal denials based on those policies if you are an exception to the rationale that they use to create those policies. And the reason for that is the Lanterman Act always trumps the POS, the purchase of service policies. So yes, we respect the purchase of service policies, but if based on individual need, if they don't make sense or they are more restrictive than the law, then you can advocate and appeal denials that were denied due to their own policies. Okay. All right. Let me just quickly check the chat, see if I'm missing anything. Please, again, know that you can ask any questions, any comments there. So let me know if there's any questions up to this part that we've discussed. Okay. This section here, anything, Myra?
No, I was just going to say there's no questions in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So another point that we reviewed here, and so important, we talked about the goals and objectives of the Lanterman Act, okay? And those are the goal of the reason why a regional center provides services, right, is to, one, make sure that people can have health and safety and live their lives as typically as they can, right? So as closely as a person lives who does not have a disability. And then two, the reason why regional center provides services is to ensure that individuals with disabilities can remain within their home versus living in institutions, okay? Three, the purpose of regional center services are to maximize independence, to increase independence. And then three is this concept of the least restrictive environment, which in this context we'll describe as they have the right to be integrated in their community and not in the restrictive environment, away from community, right? Maybe just in their home, okay? So according to the Lanterman Act, regional center provides services in order to ensure health and safety, that people can remain in their own home, that people can have independence and be integrated into their communities. So if these are the goals of regional center, okay, and the goals and objectives based on the Lanterman Act, then one strategy is to always make sure that when you're going to ask for a service, connect it to one of these four things. I need this service because, and insert one of these four, right? So it can make a huge difference if you ask for a service. Let's say my son needs swimming, right? And my reasoning could be, oh, he loves the water so much. And I'm going to be a little sarcastic, right? He loves the water. He smiles. He lives his best life in the water, right? Love that. And I can appreciate that, right? But technically, and here's my exaggerated sarcasm, the law doesn't say provide services to people so they can smile and be happy, right? So if I can say my son needs swimming for his health and safety. We have a pool in our home, and he is 5, and the pool is so accessible, he might drown, right? He needs swimming lessons. Or let's say you have letters from a therapist or a occupational therapist who says your son would really benefit from swimming. He has a very weak core, right? His trunk is is not as strong. So swimming would help him strengthen his core, his torso, right? That is now related to health and safety, right? Versus just saying he loves swimming, right? Now it's connected to one of the goals of the law, health and safety. Okay. I want a personal assistant for my son because, oh my God, he loves going to the mall. And I just want him to be able to go to the mall. Versus, right, without a personal assistant, my son is restricted and segregated at home without any community integration. My son needs a personal assistant to go and be part of his community. Very different, right? So it can be so helpful to connect the request that I have for a service to one of these foundational principles, right? If the law is there, and if regional center is supposed to give me a service so that these things can be true, then let me anchor my request on one of these 4 concepts. Sometimes it might touch 2 concepts, right? For health and safety, and so he could increase his independence, right? He doesn't know, he's not aware of danger. And so he'll touch the stove, he'll open up the door to strangers. So that's kind of health and safety and independence, right? He'll never be able to live alone if he doesn't capture this essence of danger, right? And how to protect himself. So now we see those 2 things reflected, right? And so sometimes this helps us speak the same language with the regional center, right? And we want to support your collaborative relationship with the regional center, right? So sometimes in the meeting, both parties might be saying the same thing, but it may sound different, right? And so if we can speak more of this language, then perhaps there could be some more effective communication between families and the regional center when they're going to request services, right? So again, so this point of it can be so important to, again, connect your request to one of these 4 foundational concepts. Okay. And then, we looked at the goals and objectives, and now we look at the limits of regional center. Okay. Just like it has goals, it also has some boundaries or some limits, some limitations. One of those limits is, and you may have heard this several times, but one of those limits is that regional center is the payer of last resort. They are the last ones to pay. And so what they'll often tell families is generic services are first. You may approach regional center and they may say generic services are first. Okay. And so what we looked at is the example, and I believe this is where we left off, the example of 3 doors, right? And we're going to say, well, door number 1 is the school district. Okay. Door number 2 are generic services. And technically generic services are anything and everything that is not regional center, right? So your insurance, IHSS, SSI, if the YMCA has free swimming lessons or free art classes during the summer, that's a generic service. If there's a local church that has a youth group that goes to social outings every Saturday, that might be a generic service. Instead of asking for social skills group from regional center, I may be able to access that from my community, right? So generic services are anything and everything that is not regional center. And then thirdly, the regional center is door number 3. And so when the law says generic services are first, what that means is anytime you go to regional center, they're going to ask, have you knocked on door number 1 and 2 already? Right? Because if you can get it from door number 1 and 2, you must. Right? We, door number 3, regional center, is the payer of last resort. And that is based on the Lanterman Act, right? They should be the last ones to pay or provide a service. However, a few things to consider here. The law also says the service should be appropriate. So let's say that your son or daughter needs mental health counseling. And keep in mind, one of your true-false questions was if regional center can provide mental health services as needed, right? And the answer to that would be yes, right? And this would be the circumstance under which this might be true, okay? So let's say you go to the regional center, you're asking for mental health counseling, some sort of counseling service, and they say, go to your insurance, right? Go to door number 2. You have to look for it somewhere else before, before you come to us, because we are the payer of last resort. This is true, right? So you go to your insurance, and your insurance, scenario number 1, your insurance says, we do have someone, but we have a waiting list, okay? We have someone, we can take you, but we have a waiting list of 8 months. You may put yourself on that waiting list and then come back to regional center and say, I am requesting GAP, G-A-P, GAP services, meaning I need you to provide the mental health counseling in the interim during this wait list period, because my son or daughter needs this right now, right? Not 8 months from now. They need it right now. So I'm asking you to provide GAP services. When the insurance calls me and tells me they're ready for us, then we will stop regional center services and go to the mental health counseling under my insurance. Okay, that's scenario 1. That can happen. Same with the school. If you are going through a due process with the school on a service or something like that, you could go to regional center and say, listen, I'm trying to get it from door number 1, but I'm going to a due process for that. In the interim, I need you to provide this service. You can. Okay. Scenario number 2, based on the mental health counseling that we were saying. So scenario number 2 could be you go to your insurance and they say, oh yeah, okay, we have a mental health agency that we could refer you to. You go to the mental health agency. They have therapists available. But during the assessment, the therapist finds out, oh, your son has autism and or any other diagnosis, right? And or your son is nonverbal, or they use an alternative method of communication. And so the therapist says that's out of my wheelhouse, right? I don't have experience in that. I don't know how to do therapy with someone who uses an alternative method or is nonverbal. We can't serve you. What we would want to do in that scenario is get that in writing. And then what can we do? Go back to door number 3 and say, we already tried, but their service is not appropriate. They don't have the therapist skilled to work with my son. So what am I doing? Coming back to door number 3. Because yes, again, the law says generic services first, but the law also says the services must be appropriate. So if a therapist is not trained in the method of communication or etc., right, is not aware of your son's disability and what all that entails and how that impacts his mental health, it's going to be difficult. right? Prior to being my background's in social work. And so I was a clinical therapist for a few years. And what I learned, and this was under Medi-Cal, it was under regular insurance. And so what I quickly learned is, I had a disability background when I was a social worker, but especially back in, 2010, 2011, when I was in school, they, as therapists, we don't really get, we don't get lessons on how to even modify, right, certain strategies or modalities with individuals with disabilities. And so most of my coworkers, they would get someone with autism, and very quickly I became like the autism, where's the therapist? Who knows, right? And very often that person would get referred out to a regional center when indeed that person needed mental health counseling, right? But because the fields are still sort of learning about each other, and do know that as state council, we're trying to merge those. Part of some of the trainings that I do are training therapists on how to modify some of their modalities, strategies, tools to be able to work with individuals with disabilities that may be nonverbal, that may be highly dysregulated, et cetera. So we are, as state council, trying to close that gap. But indeed, there is still a gap, right, where these two systems aren't necessarily aware or, connected enough. And so what I'm saying with all this is it may be necessary for regional center to be the one to provide a provider of mental health counseling with an agency that specializes or that has staff who have the expertise to work with someone with a developmental disability and a mental health disorder, right? And so the crossover of those two things is a specialty, right? And so that specialty may not be found under generic services. You may indeed have to return to regional center and ask for those things. Okay, so when we talk about these generic services, that's sort of the gist. Now, the last thing I want to say in regard to these three doors and this concept of generic services, keep in mind that because recreational and educational services were restored, so in 2009, recreational services were taken away, right, with budget cuts and all of that. But those were reinstated. And so what that means is regional center, I'll say it this way first and then I'll explain myself. Regional center can provide the gravy. Okay, so this is what I mean by that. If, let's say, the school is providing communication, let's say the school evaluation says that your son or daughter should have 20 minutes of speech and language every week, but the school only agrees to provide 10 minutes out of those 20 minutes. What you can do now is go request the additional 10 minutes from the regional center. Okay, so the school system can provide the main stuff, and then regional center could provide the gravy, the additional stuff, right, that the school isn't providing. So with educational and recreational services being reinstated, I believe last year or 2 years ago already, everything's a blur after 2020, right? But so with that being true, that's what that means. That now regional center can provide the additional services that you may need, including recreation, okay? Do keep in mind, I'm gonna interrupt my showing here. Keep in mind that on this link that we've shared with you, give me 1 second as I navigate this. I probably won't find it. Keep in mind, in your Google Drive link, I have provided a trifold for you that provides a list of common services funded through Regional Center. And under that pamphlet, you'll find a category that says recreational services. okay, and educational services like tutoring, etc. And so do feel free to take a look at that trifold, the little pamphlet, to become even more aware of what that might look like, okay? And I see a question in the chat, and it says, can you provide an example of what is meant by provider requirements and demonstrate progress? Sure. So I believe that was in the previous slide, right? Yeah. So let's go with provider requirements, okay? So keep in mind, the regional center is required to provide certain services and supports, right? Keep in mind that the provider themselves has the right to say, we can't see you, we can't provide a service to you. One, because they may have requirements like the following. So, for example, I worked for a social skills, for a provider, and we provided social skills, adapted skills, and we had social skills groups. So part of the requirement to be part of that group is, one, the parent had to participate in a parent support group in a room adjacent to where the children were. That was requirement one. And two, the child had to demonstrate regulation, physical regulation, to be part of that group. And what that meant was there was times where we would get a parent and their child, but the child was highly dysregulated in the group, right? So it was very apparent that entering the social environment made them very anxious. They would begin to, become self-injurious or aggressive toward the peers. So in that instance, the provider can say, it doesn't seem like this program is appropriate, right? Our program is not appropriate for your child at this time. So I know when that happened in our agency, one of the things that we would do, because we also provided in-home services, we would say, for the social skills group, the program's not appropriate, but it sounds like, or it looks like, your child might benefit from support in home so that he could develop foundational skills. And then maybe in a few years, he'd be ready now with foundational regulation, communication skills to be able to join the social skills group again. We saw that happen several times where kids would leave for 2-3 years sometimes, and they would go to our other in-home program where a therapist would challenge them with sharing, with flexibility, and they were able to develop their tolerance and regulation in individual sessions and then rejoin the social skills group 2-3 years later. Right. And so that's what we might look like. That's what provider requirements might look like, right? That the provider has the right to set their requirements and say, at this time, you don't meet the requirements. Sometimes it was because the parent wasn't showing up. And remember, our requirement was the parent and the child and the parent have to be present, right? So when the parent was absent, they weren't showing up, we would say, hey, our requirement is you have to, be here and be part of it too. So if you can't, the program might not be appropriate for you. So that's what provider requirement might look like. Okay, let me know, the person who asked, let me know if that's clear on that, in that respect. Demonstrate progress, similar example. But so when the law says they must demonstrate progress, is that they have to demonstrate progress, because that's what demonstrates that the service is having some kind of positive outcome, right? So they're not demonstrating progress. Why are we continuing to fund for it? Regional center might ask, right? If we see no progress, what's happening? So point number one, actually, before I forget, that I would like to make. I know that when I provided direct services with some individuals, remaining instead of regressing was the progress. So I would support the family in demonstrating that to regional center. because regional center might look at a progress report and say, they're not making any progress. All while we know the individual and we're saying, hey, man, they have gone through some crises, but they haven't regressed. They haven't gone backwards. So them actually staying steady, not being hospitalized, not having to increase medication, not having several aggressive, incidents a month, that is the progress. The fact that it hasn't gotten worse is the progress. So sometimes it requires some, I was going to say outside of the box thinking, but it's not even that. It's just really, for regional center, some of the people at regional center may have never provided direct services. So they may not know what that looks like. And so sometimes you may need someone to advocate, your therapist, your provider, right? Because I know in reports, I would specify that in the report and say the progress is the lack of regression, right? The fact that this person hasn't been hospitalized in 2 years is the progress. Their anxiety may still be there, but they haven't regressed, right? So I want to make that point. So keep in mind that that may be something to consider. But in terms of progress, number 2, indeed, sometimes it may mean that if they're not making progress, the service they are currently getting may not be the best. So keep in mind the example I gave about the social skills group. So sometimes we might be able to say, you're right, they're not making progress. But that just doesn't mean we're going to get rid of the service and you're done. What that means is it opens up the questioning of why aren't they making progress? If they're not making progress, what that tells me is they actually need more support to develop foundational skills that will help them later on demonstrate progress in these higher level areas, if that makes sense. So the example of the child who would come into the social skills group, not do well, actually, he seemed to react adversely to the social skills group. So sure, regional center would say, they're not demonstrating progress, we're not going to fund for this anymore. Makes sense, sure. However, what this child needs is in-home, what they need is communication, and what they need is adaptive skills and social skills in the home. So the fact that they're not demonstrating progress, don't just take a service away, regional center, I might advocate, right, as a parent. But what that tells us is they actually need more support, regional center, right? They're not making progress because they've got no language, they've got no flexibility, they've got no regulation, they don't know how to identify emotions. So guess what? Those become our new needs. Now we write goals for each of these areas that we identify, and we ask for services to address those needs. So the lack of progress in one area may indicate the need itself for more support. Because if they're not demonstrating progress, it means they're lacking the skill to do so. Right? So let's get more services, probably, right, to meet that need, and then maybe they'll demonstrate progress. Okay. Doesn't lack of regression but not progress mean in certain situations mean something is missing from the individual's program? Yes. So I would say you said it perfectly and in different words that I just did, I think. Right? So the lack of progress means in your words, something's missing, right? And or I think what you're saying too is no, the program is good, or the adaptive skills in a home is good. They just need to use a different modality. Instead of ABA, can we try floor time? Right? Instead of floor time, can we try something more like play therapy, right? So sometimes it's let's change the service. Sometimes it's let's talk to the agency or the therapist and say, can we change it up a bit, right? So for some of the individuals I worked with, ABA like strategies were not effective. It was too rigid. They became adverse to it. So with them, floor time was very appropriate, right? So it looked like me sitting next to them playing a video game, right? And sometimes I would have to explain to the family, hey, we're building rapport. We're building some trust between us. This is actually called co-regulation. They're matching my energy. We're going to use this later, but this is playing video games is what this looks like right now, right? This is the intention behind it. And so, yes, so sometimes it requires the individual program to switch it up a bit. And sometimes it means letting go of a service to add on other services that may be more appropriate. Okay. Great questions. Thank you very much for that. All right. So keep in mind that your IPP is a legal contract between the regional center and the client. Okay, so it is a document where they are making a commitment to you as to what they are going to do for you. And so everything needs to be written onto the IPP because that's the contract. So if it's not in the IPP, it doesn't exist and they may not be accountable, right? Because it's not written. Okay, so the IPP is a legal contract and therefore everything should be written in there. So your goals should be in there. Okay, needs should be in there, goals should be in there, the services should be there. If you're in an IPP meeting and the team decides that, yes, we are going to approve this service, I would go on to say, let's write on the IPP when that service will begin. Heck, let's write on the IPP who will provide that service. And the reason I say that with a little grin is because sometimes parents call us and say, we had a wonderful IPP. They said yes to everything. However, it's been a month and nothing has started. So now I don't know where we go from here. So because of that, we say when you have your meeting and things are discussed, let's get that in writing into the IPP with dates, with details. And what happens if that doesn't get met? Let's say the IPP identified this service will begin September 26th. Okay, and today is September 26th. Then I now, right, maybe I might give it a few more days, right? Be reasonable. However, I now could do what's called a 4731 complaint because they're not abiding, they're not keeping their word on the IPP, right? Keep in mind that part 3 of this presentation in October will be about fair hearings and 4731 complaints. So we will answer more questions, get more into depth about these complaints and process. So that is the importance of that. Okay, so writing things on the IPP. Let me, I see another question. Can we negotiate the format of a service? For example, for respite hours, instead of 4 hours monthly, change to 120 hours quarterly. That will be very helpful to parents. Wonderful. I would say, yeah. So you can always negotiate, meaning, keep in mind, let me see, how do I say this? The negotiate, I want to use that word because keep in mind, in the law, right, it says services are individualized. So especially if you're negotiating based on someone's individualized need, we maybe shouldn't even be, not that we shouldn't call it negotiating, but it's going back to that concept of services should be person-centered and individualized. That's what that means, right? And so can we have it in the format that the person needs? That's precisely what the law says, right? So if they're not doing that, then we can bring up that concept and say, you know, the law encourages this person-centered or requires this person-centered, right? This individualized plan. So this plan doesn't look very individualized, right? You're giving me the hours according to the way you give everyone else the hours, but my individual case, we need it like this, right? It makes more sense. So it's supposed to be individualized, person-centered. It should respect the preferences of the person, okay? And so it's important to practice this language and know that it has a legal foundation, okay? So I guess what I'm trying to say to your question, know that what you're asking has a legal foundation. And so the answer is yes, right? Can we do this because it fits our family best? That's precisely what the law says, right? And so that's the conversation that you can have. And I hear you, because maybe there is a week of the month where you, the parents or family comes and you don't need a lot of respite that week, but then the other months you need a lot of it because you're going to go out of town or because you yourself as the parent are going to have surgery and you need to save those hours for later. All that makes sense, right? So sometimes it takes communicating that to the regional center and explaining why those changes are necessary. But again, to this question, absolutely. Services should be person-centered, which means they should be individualized, and they should meet the preference of the person and or family. Okay, so yes. Is there a time frame by which a regional center must provide the written IPP? Good question. To my understanding, no, not a specific time frame. And so, and I think what I hear from your question, give me 1 second. Is there a time frame by which a regional center must provide the written IPP? So I'm guessing you're saying we're having the meeting, we're developing the IPP. By when do they have to give me the final one? Is kind of what I'm understanding that you're saying. Feel free to confirm that. Let's see. Yes. So typically it's one, I'm going to answer to that. No, it's my understanding the law doesn't include that time frame. Okay. Now, sometimes what we hear is sometimes they're working on it as you guys are talking. And so sometimes they even print it and would like you to sign it in the moment, to which we give you some information to consider, meaning keep in mind it's not really suggested that you sign on that day. You have to sign it within a reasonable amount of time. What does reasonable mean? It's very subjective, right? So it would depend on a hearing judge and what they think is reasonable. Okay, so if a judge thinks 2 weeks is reasonable, there you go. If a different judge thinks 1 month is reasonable, so be it. But so in fact, I think this next slide, give me 1 second. Yeah, I think this next slide talks about you don't have to sign on that day. Okay, and so if let's say you did an IPP, they were supposed to get you a final one and they did not. What we might say is, one, make sure that you have that kind of stuff in writing. Okay, so if they don't give you things in writing, you can put things in writing. We actually call this letters of understanding. And I switched over to that part of the presentation. So a letter of understanding is a letter that the parent can write themselves. And they can say, you know, dear such and such, on such and such day, we spoke on the phone or we met for our IPP meeting. I was told that the final draft would be given to me in a few days. It has now been 3 weeks after our IPP. I still don't have the IPP. This is delaying, starting the services for my child. This is detrimental, whatever you want to say. And then we suggest always anything that you do in writing to the regional center or any other system for that matter, you can identify the phrase, if anything in this letter is incorrect, please notify me within a reasonable amount of time. Then the next step is making sure that you have a receipt or you have proof that they received your letter. Okay, so you would write this letter. You can either take it in person, take a copy and have them sign it and stamp it so that you have proof that they received it, and or you can send it by registered mail. Okay, for this type of communication, we don't necessarily suggest email. One, because keep in mind that email, you only have proof that you sent it. If they never reply, you don't really have proof that they received it, right? So then what we want to do is have proof that they received it. And so the more secure way of doing that is, again, either taking it in person and having them sign and stamp, or sending it through registered mail. And they'll send you back a little card with a signature of the person who received it. Okay. Now, I want us to take note. This sentence says, if anything in this letter is incorrect, please notify me within a reasonable amount of time. What does this little phrase do? Okay. What this is saying is, if you didn't reply to me, that means everything in my letter is true, right? Because it said, if anything in this letter is incorrect, notify me. So if in my letter, I described the chain of events that happened and how the regional center didn't call me back and how the regional center told me that they were going to give me something in 2 weeks, and now it's been 6 weeks, and now my son is suffering because of this, because of the lack of services, then it makes all of my letter be true, because they never rebutted, if you would, right? They never contacted me saying it was incorrect or anything, right? And so keep in mind, these letters, I'm not going to say are the fix it all, like they're not going to fix everything, but what it does is it gives you evidence. And sometimes what ends up happening is that you need to go to a fair hearing. Because if the regional center is not providing what they said they would provide, maybe they didn't even say no, but they're just delaying it. They just haven't said anything. If that's the case, then that technically is a denial. And so you could go to a fair hearing. And in a fair hearing, what's going to be important is that you have evidence. And if you have nothing in writing, that's going to make it tougher for you to demonstrate how the regional center did or didn't do something, because it's your word against theirs, right? And in the eyes of the hearing judge, who are they going to give probably a bit more credit to? The regional center, right? And so the parent, having these letters, having receipt that they did receive it, that they did know about this, and they never got back to you, that demonstrates something to the hearing judge, right? And again, we're going to talk more about this in October, but that's why we encourage these letters. So if they don't respect the time frame, if they're not, doing what they offered or said to do, in writing, and again, with a receipt that they received it. Okay. So again, this concept, and thank you for your questions. Please feel free to keep asking questions if you have them. Okay. So second, we discussed based on the law, services should be person-centered, right? Individualized and person-centered. And as we mentioned, they must respect the consumer's preferences. This means language. This means setting. This means, right, preferences. Excuse me. Okay, so as we go on, again, you can record your IPP meetings as long as you give them 24-hour notice. Make your requests known in the meeting in writing. This is where we come again with that point of writing everything on the IPP. Request that a decision maker be present. You may want to do that. Sometimes it may work, sometimes it may not. But you may say, you know, the last time that we had an IPP meeting, we had a great meeting, but then my service coordinator said she couldn't really approve or tell me anything. She had to go speak to her supervisor. So can I request that in this meeting, the supervisor be present so that we can expedite this process? Okay. Make disagreements clear and request that they be included in the IPP. Okay. And obtain a response. Here goes to the question, right? Within a reasonable amount of time. The law may not specify a time frame, but it does say a reasonable amount of time. And then we want to make sure we are communicating before the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting. If you weren't given a copy of your IPP, okay, you may want to do a letter summarizing what you understood from what you guys agreed and disagreed on, okay? Just in case that IPP takes longer than appropriate, you have in writing what happened. That's why it's so important also for you to record the meeting. Because let's say that IPP never gets to you and you want to go to a fair hearing. What's going to be your proof? The recording, right? Look at the transcript of this recording. In this recording, they approved every single service verbally, but then they never gave me anything in writing, right? So that's why it's so important to have it in writing. Okay, and to have it recorded in case you don't get it in writing. Okay. This is another point to talking about the importance of having receipt that they received it. Another thing is keeping a record of timelines. Keep your calendar, right? Or a separate sheet of paper where you do a timeline and say on this date, they received the letter of me requesting an IPP meeting. What are 30 days from now, right? Keeping a timeline so that you know if they're breaking the law, right? If there are time frame requirements, but you don't keep track of the time, I don't know about you, but there's times where I cannot believe that 3 weeks have passed by already, right? It seems like yesterday, right? Or like, oh my goodness, we're in October, what? Right? So I may not even be aware that the 30 days are over. They already passed it. And now I get to choose what to do about it. But if I don't even know that the time frame passed, so it's important to keep records of timelines. Okay. Now I will take you to this RULA. There is a book by Disability Rights California, and they format. They have a book that's formatted in question and answer based on the Lanterman Act. So the Lanterman Act, or any law really, is a little bit dry and complicated to read sometimes, right? Lots of commas, lots of shalls, must, all that stuff. And so what Disability Rights California did is they composed a book, question and answer, and then the answer is based on the law, and it refers you to the sections of the law that you could read into further. So I'll take you to that in just a second, just so you could look at it, but highly, highly recommend it. They have one for the Lanterman Act. They also have a book. It's called the SIR, Special Education Rights and Responsibilities. So it is also a question and answer book, but based on special education law. So I'll take you to their website before we end today. But keep that in mind. Okay. Now, again, our presentation next month will be on 4731 complaints and fair hearings. Okay. But again, know that you can always appeal a denial from the regional center. Okay, the law has recently changed. The fair hearing process has recently changed. In the past, you only had 30 days to appeal, right? So after their denial, you had 30 days. The law actually recently changed, and now you have 60 days. You have more time to think about appealing. Okay, so now you have 60 days to appeal any denial of service, whether that is we're not going to give you a service or whether that is they want to reduce a service. You can appeal any of those things. And then whenever they are breaking the law, violating your rights, you always have the right to do a 4731 complaint. And again, we will speak more in depth about this next month. Okay, so keep in mind that as a strategy in for regional center and for any meeting, really, questions are collaborative versus statements. Sometimes when we make a statement, it's not as collaborative as asking a question. Okay, definitely accusations and yelling are not collaborative, right? And we throw that piece in here because based on the phone calls we get sometimes, we can't imagine how frustrating it must be sometimes, right? To be in a meeting and to feel sometimes like you're not being heard or like you're being denied everything. And so we can ask for a break as needed, right? To be able to regulate ourselves and remain focused and appropriate and collaborative. And so we find that questions are a helpful way of getting information. Instead of me accusing or pointing a finger, I may rephrase that statement into a question and it may make such a difference. Okay, so usually questions makes people want to help you. You can change the other person's mind by asking questions, and you can prepare for the fair hearing, okay, in that way. Because what happens when you ask questions is you're making them say what they think, right? And when you ask it in a different way, you're making them repeat what they said earlier. And you can really take the point home that this is what they said, this is what they meant, because they repeated it over and over again. And this may be something that helps you in a fair hearing. Okay. Things to think about in terms of our behavior in the meeting. We always want to be the most reasonable person in the room. And even as I say that, know that we know that that must be difficult sometimes, right? We understand that there are lots of emotions roaming in the room when meetings happen, but we must always remain reasonable. It will be to your benefit. Especially keep in mind that when you're recording a meeting, you're not just recording them, you're recording yourself. And so you want to make sure that also nothing you say in the meeting can be misconstrued in a different way and paint you, right, in a way that is not favorable in a fair hearing. Okay, so open hostility is not going to win the day, right? It might feel good to say a few things, but it's not going to win the day. And then regardless of how upset you feel, always being respectful. And again, remembering it's okay to ask for a break. It is as much your meeting as it is their meeting. Okay, and so what we want to make sure is that you're taking breaks if you need it. Okay, so all in all, regional center IPP meetings are meant to be a space where you and regional center get together to discuss the person's needs, to develop goals that will be written onto the IPP, and to determine what services are needed in order to achieve those goals. Okay, in that process, it's important for you to record your meeting. It's important for you to write a parent report so that your voice can be on that IPP through that parent report. It's important that you ask questions. It's important that you remain composed and collaborative, and important that you do not have to sign that document during that meeting. You can take it home, review it, make sure that it reflects what you guys spoke about, and then sign it within a reasonable amount of time. Remember that we discussed that it's important for you to anchor your requests on legal foundations, which are, remember that regional center is there to provide services in order to ensure that a person can have and maintain their health and safety, increase their independence, be integrated into their community, and be able to remain in their own home and not in an institution. Okay, and so all of our requests for services can be anchored on these concepts. Okay, so feel free to review this information. Okay, you have different resources that I will review right now with you. Okay, and I'm going to answer a question that I see on the chat, and then we're going to briefly review these true-false questions, okay? Someone asked, what is an average length of time for an IPP meeting? Boy, I would say that typically they get scheduled for an hour or two. And for regional center, I would say that's about the average. But know that there are some meetings that take longer, and they can, okay? Doesn't mean they always should. You know, if you don't need to make it longer, you don't have to. But that's pretty much the average length. Now, one thing, just a little point to make on that. Keep in mind that if you see that the regional center is saying no on something, you may take some time to try to advocate and change their mind, but in the the time frame of the meeting, what may sometimes be helpful is to say, okay, sounds like we disagree on this. I'm going to make a note of that. Please give me that in writing so that I can do a fair hearing on that. Let's move on to the next request, right? Let's just move on, because sometimes meetings will take long because we're going round and round. And if the round and round is helping, then sure. But keep in mind that sometimes it may be best to just move the meeting along. Give me a yes, give me a no. If it's a no, give it to me in writing so I can go appeal. And let's get this moving. Because sometimes what we see is denial by delay, right? They're not saying no, but there's such delay that technically it's a denial. And so sometimes what may happen is we have a 2-hour meeting and then we say, well, let's meet again. And now it takes another 2 weeks to schedule that next meeting. And then that meeting takes another 2 hours and we still don't feel like we're finished because we've been going round and round. And so now we schedule another meeting. So now it's been 2 months. So while we continue to meet and elongate this process, keep in mind, nothing is happening. No service is being given, nothing's moving forward. So only you can determine how long these things should go for, and you can determine when does this just need to stop and we move on. And we agree to disagree, and I can make the choice of going to a fair hearing or what I'm going to do. Okay, so keep that in mind. If my child has a diagnosis of autism, they are automatically eligible for regional center. False. So earlier in part 1, if you answered false, you are correct. Okay. So remember that a diagnosis is not enough. They've got to meet the eligibility criteria, which includes 1, okay, you must the condition had to have began before the age of 18. 2, the second, which means 2, you have to demonstrate one of the identified diagnoses. 3, you have to demonstrate substantial disability in at least 3 of the 7 areas. And 4, the condition had to be expected to last indefinitely, okay? So that's why this question is false, because autism itself is not enough to be automatically eligible for regional center. The regional center must have an IPP with me within 30 days, not 20. So that's why this one was false. My IPP meeting must be held at the regional center office. False. That's why this one is also false. It must be held in my home. Nope. It's supposed to be held based on the preference of the family or the person. So it can be in your home, it can be on Zoom, it can be in the park, it could be at the regional center, it could be at a Starbucks. Truly, it can be based on the preference of the person. I have the right to record my IPP meeting. Yes, you do. Okay. And again, as long as you give 24-hour notice. I have to sign my IPP document the same day of the meeting for my child service to continue. False. You must do it within a reasonable amount of time. The regional center service policies are the ones that determine what services I can get and which I can't. False. Okay. Because remember that the policies may be restrictive, and the law trumps the policies. Okay. So the need is what should determine the services that you get. My child can receive mental health counseling services through the regional center if needed. True. And we mentioned this, right? If generic services do not have an appropriate counseling service for your son or daughter, then that means that the regional center may be the appropriate one to offer that. The regional center is the last to pay for services my child needs. Yes, right? We reviewed that. We also reviewed, though, remember, the regional center is the last to pay, and they can also provide the gravy, okay, as we mentioned. The regional center must offer me the service that is appropriate and least expensive. Very true. Must be appropriate, but they, based on the law, should go for the least expensive. But if the least expensive doesn't meet your need, then that's not an appropriate service. So the money doesn't matter, right? What matters is that it's appropriate. But among the appropriate services, should they go for the least expensive? Yes. Okay. If my child has severe behaviors and is at risk of being a danger to self or others, the regional center must offer options for him or her to move away from home into a group home. False. They should first explore support at home. So regardless of how severe the person's behaviors or condition may be, institutions should never be the first option, right? Supports and services at home are the first option that should be explored. If the family of the person wants to explore out-of-home placement, absolutely, right? But supports at home should be explored first. I have the right to appeal and request a fair hearing when the regional center denies a service. True. Okay. And keep in mind that October 24th at 11:30, we will be reviewing the fair hearing process and complaints, 4731 complaint. So feel free to join us. It's my understanding, I believe it's this same link where you would log on to in order to have this training. And actually my colleague, Albert Feliciano, will be the one doing that training. Okay, so he will be focusing on the fair hearing process and the recent changes to the fair hearing, as well as the complaints. Okay, so that takes us to the end. Again, know that that in the chat, you have the link to access this presentation, okay, and all the other materials that we discussed. And if you would be so kind, and I'll give the time to Myra in just a second if they have any other surveys. But if you would press the link on the chat, it'll take you to a different page. It's not a Zoom poll, but it'll take you to a brief survey, and it will look something like this. And you can answer yes, no. You can see the survey on my screen. Yeah, so you can answer yes, no, write a few brief questions, and then just submit here at the bottom. And that would be really helpful to us. That's what helps us demonstrate that these trainings are effective, are still needed. So please feel free to fill that out. You can fill it out now in these minutes that we have, and or you can press that same link a little later, and that information will come out, okay? If you would like to stay in touch with us, you can subscribe to our newsletter. And also, I have provided my information there below. Okay. I see a question. It says, if a client can't get ABA in person at home, what can Regional Center do to help the client? If a client can't get ABA in person at home, I think I would need to know a little bit more about this question. But in general, one, ABA is provided by insurance. And so insurance is who you would have to navigate that with first. If there are ABA providers that are only providing it on Zoom, let's say, and you say Zoom is not effective for my son or daughter, I need it in person in my home, then what you may need to do is request a different provider who has different requirements or who offers the service in person at home. If that's not available, make sure you get that in writing so you could demonstrate that the generic service or the insurance didn't have the appropriate service, and then you could request it from Regional Center. So if through the insurance they're not offering ABA in the format that you need it, then get that in writing, and then you can request that from Regional Center. Okay, that's available 6 to 8 months. Yeah, so sometimes ABA through insurance is only available for a limited amount of time. So if you went to the insurance, had it for 6 to 8 months, but you continue to need it, but the insurance can no longer provide it, make sure to get that in writing, take it to the Regional Center. And now you can request to get it from the Regional Center. If they deny that, then what do? Consider going to a fair hearing. Okay? And make sure you come on October to listen to the training. All right. Let's see. Do we have another one? I'll get a letter from the provider, then go to Regional Center. Yes. And the person asking that question, if, through that process, when you're navigating that process, you'd like to give us a call to sort of just make sure you're following the right steps or what else can I do, please feel free to reach out. Okay. And we can help with those questions. All right. Any other questions where can we get information about the change in education, social, and rec services? You can give us a call. We can give you more information. In general, though, it might be helpful to look under your own Regional Center, and they should have a list of providers on their website, and you can see what social, rec, and educational services they have on that list. So if you'd like to call us, tell us what Regional Center you're a part of, and sort of navigate that, we can do that. Okay. And actually, before, if it's okay with you guys, I forgot, I mentioned that I would show you guys where to find the RULA. You have a link, but if you go to Disability Rights California, mine's going to come out really quick. But if you go to Disability Rights California and you go right here to resources, and then you scroll all the way down. First of all, this is cool, right? They've got resources on all these topics. So feel free to click on the one that's you're interested in. But if you scroll all the way down here, you'll find the 2 books that I mentioned. One, The Rights Under the Lanterman Act, which is the one we talked about today. And then SIR, which is the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities. So if you click on it, okay, you'll see. So let's say I have questions about community participation, work day, and leisure activities, okay? So now they have questions and answers. What does the Lanterman Act say about things like community participation, work, day activities, and leisure? How do I have the right, what do I have a right to make choices and decisions about? Must I use generic resources to help me work? So if you click on the question, then it'll provide you with the answer. And then what's cool is it also provides you with a section of the law. Okay, so without overloading you too much, I'm gonna, if you then go to Ledge Info, and I can put this on the chat, okay. If you go to Ledge Info, right here, you can search any part of the law, okay? So if you know what you're looking for, so like in this case, it said section 4644, you go to Ledge Info, you go to code, it's always gonna be the last one because it's WIC, okay, Welfare and Institutions Code. And now we can write what? 4644. Oops. And then it says section B. Okay, so here's A, here's B. For purposes of this section, generic agency means any agency which has a legal responsibility to serve all members of the general public and which is receiving public funds for providing such services, right? So insurance, IHSS, SSI. So now you can look at the actual law, okay? So this is kind of cool here, right? Section 4685.8. I can go back, 46, what? 4685. Short-term memory here for me, okay? And it said D3B, okay? So we're gonna look for D. There's D, number 3, capital letter B. Okay, this is a whole other training on how to read the law, but this is how we would do it, right? So know that the law is actually written with lowercase letters, then numbers, then under the numbers are uppercase letters, okay? So you'll see D, little d, 3, and big B, right? So that's how you navigate and look for it. If you're familiar with like the Bible has books and then chapters and then verses. So it's kind of similar like that. When you read the law, it's, you know, what section, what letter, what number, and then what uppercase letter, right? And then sometimes the uppercase letters have Roman numerals under them, right? So anyway, so this is the RULA. This is how the information is presented. This is where you could go to find out more about those sections in the law. And if you want to search those sections in the law, you can go to Ledge Info and or in your Google Drive, I'll actually put a copy of the Lanterman Act and you can sort of search. I think this is a little easier because you can input the section and it'll just give you the section you want. But if you want the whole Lanterman Act, feel free to go to your Google Drive and I'll input it there, okay? All right, let me stop sharing. And I think I see a question. Okay, perfect. Okay, good. Oh, good. Oh, thank you so much. Reading some comments on the chat. Awesome. Okay, I will pass it to you, Myra. Thank you, everyone, and thank you. And